on behalf of the Jewish Unity Through Diversity Institute, Ray Connectar, Sammy, Jeannie Milgram, and of course the Certificate of Sephardic Ancestry. We are really excited to be highlighting today the film 1506. Hopefully you have seen it, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to. We will send again the links in a follow-up email that you should be getting in the next day or two. So don't worry if you haven't seen it yet, but we will be talking about not only the film, but we'll also be talking about the actual events that happened there and what the repercussions, not repercussions, but what it means for today. So it will really be from history to today, and we do encourage you to please be involved. Your cameras and microphones are muted, but please do put comments and questions into the chat, and I will try to monitor as much as possible. So on that note, we're going to start with Dara. So thank you first for coming, and I'm going to introduce her. I'm going to let you introduce yourself more, but quickly. Dara Jeffries is the Vice President of the Jewish Community of Oporto, of which she has been a member since she was a child. She is also a representative of the community with respect to its cultural endeavors internationally, and has spoken at international film festivals and conferences about the community's films, museums, and educational programs. And yes, you did hear films. We will talk about that. Dara holds a master's in languages from Oxford University, a Portuguese law degree, and a US law degree, and is a practicing attorney. Dara and her husband Dale, a retired musician and professor, have 2 grown sons and split their time between Portugal and Miami. Again, hopefully everyone has seen the film and listened when we spoke about 1497 a while back. So let's get into what the film is about, and just in general. First, welcome, Dara.
Thank you.
Is there anything I missed in the biography that you think is very necessary?
I don't think so.
Okay, I'm definitely open to listening, because I'm sure we'll get into more of your story as we get through. So we're going to begin with you. Tell us just an overview of the film, just to make sure we're all on the same page, if you would. Like what happened and where it happened.
Well, this happened. I think what's important to understand is that this happened between 2 very key moments, right? It happened between 1496, which was the order of expulsion, and 1536, which was when the Inquisition started. So this is something, which people don't know about, and it happened in Lisbon, and it happened over the course of a couple of days, but it happened, way before the Inquisition. So it's not even linked to the Inquisition. It's which I think people don't know. So that's in terms of historic context. So you have it between the time that there's an expulsion, and many Jews did not go, as people know. And the reason for that are various, but I think mostly logistical. And it wasn't so easy to get ships, and there are other reasons I can explain later. But, so many people ended up staying, and then that's when you have some of the hidden Jews, and they went into hiding, and you have, and then you have the converts, either real converts or the so-called fake converts, right? So they converted to Christianity, at least apparently. And I think, that's one of the reasons that created a lot of hostility with the church, because of these, what they considered were fake conversions. So that's sort of the context of what happened.
Okay, and then you decided to, like we said, this isn't the first film that was made.
Right.
And what's the significance of this series of films, and why is it important to make specifically this film on 1506? What was so?
Yeah, so yeah, let me give a little bit of background then. I think some of you know and some of you don't know, but this isn't, as you mentioned, is not the first film we've made. The Jewish community has made a highly acclaimed film, actually won a lot of prizes, called 1618, and it's now distributed by Goldwyn. And that's about the visit of the Inquisition to the city of Oporto. We made another movie called Sefarad, which recounts the history of the community, and it celebrated its centennial last year. So that was really important for us. And it tells the story of its first president, Captain Barros Basto, who achieved this incredible feat of building the largest synagogue in the Iberian Peninsula, on the eve of World War II. It was inaugurated in 1938, under a fascist regime. So it was quite an extraordinary feat And then I'm not going to get into the whole story of Sepharad, but he is known internationally.
And we did talk about it. I just want to make sure people remember that we did talk about it at one
We
point.
did have a series on Sepharad. Yes, we did.
Yes. So
and he was expelled from the army for having practiced circumcision. So basically, we've been interested in telling the various stories about the history of the Jews in Portugal. And, it started with Sepharad because it started with us telling the story of our own community, which was very personal to us. And then we realized we wanted to expand that into more of the history of Jews in Portugal in general. And so the idea of this film came about because this was such an important event in Portugal, such a historic and serious event. And we thought it should be told. And so the idea of telling this story came about well before October 7th. But when October 7th happened, that was the catalyst that spurred the community into getting it produced in record time. We were witnessing the rise in anti-Semitism, even in Portugal, we've always been very proud to not have very much of it. But we started to see that happening even against our own community in very insidious ways. And so our response has always been to educate and demystify. And this particular event was of such enormous proportions, and that people honestly, I didn't know about it either. I mean, until we really started researching this, it wasn't something that people knew or talked about. So, film is a really unique way to tell a story and educate, and that was really why we did it.
And the film itself has quite a bit of detail in it, and the history, you can tell that there was a lot of research into the history there, and it has some visual elements that are a bit disturbing, especially in light of October 7th, if I may. Why was it important to keep in those kinds of details, to show the violence?
Because that's what it was about, right? I mean, that's really literally what it was about. And I mean, we did keep the film to 20 minutes because it's disturbing. And we also tried to, I mean, it seems graphic, but believe me, it could have been much more graphic, and efforts were made to make it less graphic. But I think, we felt it was very important for people to understand the real barbaric nature of what occurred, and the sheer glee with which these things were carried out, and the sheer enthusiasm that people, in committing these acts. And the scenes are real. I mean, they're based on historic research from contemporaneous sources. I can list a few names. Garcia Resende, Solomon Vega, Andres Bernaldez. And then we also had support from the University of Lisbon Sephardic Studies Department to help us do that. 3,000 people or more actually were massacred in the space of a couple of days. And it's really important to learn from history. Pogroms and attacks on Jews have occurred every generation in every country. And each time it's as though we're starting all over, like it was the first time, like this has never happened before. And so it's really important that Jews, not just Jews actually, but everybody knows that such events start with conspiracy theories and hate speech that turn into violence and murder. And, I live in the US and I hear all the time how it's all about free speech and free speech shouldn't be limited. But hate speech is dangerous and it leads to very real consequences. And, that is the point of the film. You can see what happens when people believe in conspiracy theories and it gets taken too far.
Right. And it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't necessarily part of the specific Inquisition. It wasn't
No.
a government authority thing. It was really this the Dominican monks. So can you talk a little bit about that? You said you would get into that a little bit. So,
well, there's a reason why anti-Semitism has been known as the longest hatred, right? It's been fueled by conspiracy theories for millennia, and there's always been a very complicated relationship between Jews and the Catholic Church well before the Inquisition, with Jews being blamed for the murder of Christ. And, and at the time that's depicted in the film, the Catholic Church was very powerful and they were very educated, right? The priests were educated and the general populace was not so educated. And so they played a lot on ignorance and superstition. And so you could see in the film, and this is what happened at the time, is that Jews were blamed for the natural disasters, such as the plague or drought. And they were the target of hate too, because they had, positions of power and they were educated and they had quite a lot of favor with the king. And they were employed in roles that were not particularly liked, right, as tax collectors or money lenders. And that, fueled a lot of hatred as well. But the monarchs themselves employed Jews and found them very useful in the court. And even Don Manuel, who ordered the expulsion of the Jews in 1496 to please the Spanish kings, he didn't really want them to leave. And he even burned ships to prevent them from leaving. So he preferred them to stay, and even if they just pretended to convert. But for the Catholic Church, that wasn't enough, right? The conversos, they wanted, they weren't real Christians. And so that was an easy target for them. I need to add, though, to be very clear, that today we have an excellent relationship with the Catholic Church, and particularly in Porto, with the Bishop of Porto, who's been unbelievably supportive. We have a very good relationship, and we've done a lot of joint charitable missions. Actually, we received a very nice letter from the Pope, because we sent him, we did a short film called The Nun's Kaddish, which is another conversation, but we sent that to him and he liked it very much and sent us a very nice letter. So we've made a big effort, and to be honest, the Catholic Church, at least in Portugal, has made an effort as well of rapprochement, and to sort of foster good relationships with us. But that was certainly not the case, at the time that the film is depicted. So you do see the difference between the church and then the government authority, and we saw the same in Oporto in 1618. For anybody that sees 1618, it's the exact same thing. When the Inquisition happens, you have the Inquisition and the church versus the local government authorities that are very protective of the Jews and not so protective of what the church is trying to do. So it's a very interesting, ambivalence there.
And let's talk about the Porto community today a little bit. You mentioned the series of films. What are the goals? What are the points of getting across in these films? What other kind of programs are going on? We were talking before about people, they should come to Porto. Why should they come to Porto, the Jewish community?
Well, I mean, because of all the things that have happened, because of fascism and the Inquisition and the expulsion, really, there were very, very few Jews living in Portugal or practicing Judaism. And, it became our mission to create, and it's a kind of a catch-22, right? So you don't have Jews, and therefore you don't have Jewish life. And if you don't have Jewish life, it doesn't attract more Jews, because nobody wants to live there if they don't have the conditions for, to support it. And so the first step was really to create all of the sort of infrastructure, if you like, that would make it possible for Jews to practice Judaism how they would like. And that involved quite a bit, and it took quite a while. So it wasn't just, rehabilitating the synagogue and all of that, but making sure that there was sort of, kosher food available. And we now have a cemetery. We took a really long time to negotiate and buy a plot of land and get it all permitted and ready and everything. There was no Jewish cemetery. We now have a Jewish cemetery. We created, a huge infrastructure. But that's one aspect of our mission, let's say, is to create the conditions for Jews that want to live in Porto to be able to lead, Jewish life. We still don't really have a Jewish school, although there are classes and so on. So that will probably be another step in the future. But we do have like summer camps and things like that. But then I think the other part of our mission, which has been, I think, really pretty successful, is to teach the general populace about Judaism and about the Jewish community and about the history of the Jews. And we've done that with the films, but more so through the museums. So we have two museums. We have the Jewish Museum, which is just, the smaller, more local thing. And then we have the Holocaust Museum that has really become a very, very well-known and well-visited museum. We have received over 100,000 students, I think more now, I think maybe 150,000 adolescents from all over Portugal. That's more than 10% of the Portuguese teenage population. Wow. So, that's really significant, because they're, and I have to say, all the kids that come are super interested, very motivated. They ask a lot of questions, and they go away with a whole different appreciation and knowledge about what the Holocaust is, what the Jews have gone through, what it means to be Jewish. And they come away with an appreciation for Jewish culture instead of persecution. So that's basically our mission, right? Is to educate, to demystify, to create Jewish culture. We have an amazing event every year, in September 1st. I think it's September 1st. No, it's not September 1st. It's the first whatever of I think first Sunday of September. We have it's the European Day of Jewish Culture. So we've done it a few years now. And that's been incredibly successful as well, because that's the one day where we actually open the synagogue itself up to for the general public. So anybody in the public can come and visit not only the museums, but the synagogue itself, and talk to the community and ask questions. And that has been also very successful in, again, demystifying and having people come and talk to us. And that's basically what this is about. So these films are about educating and demystifying.
Have these films shown in schools around Portugal?
They're not shown in schools. They are shown, well, some of them are available on YouTube.
Right.
And then they're shown in the museums themselves. They're shown in the museums. So I don't know. I mean, we've had some success in working with Ministry of Education and so on to try and change some of their education manuals to include, Inquisition and Holocaust and that sort of thing. But we haven't gotten to where we need to be there yet, I would say, in terms of education. Definitely, there's work to be done, I think, yeah.
I think there's that work around the world. So I think you guys are ahead of the game in a lot of it.
Yeah.
Let's also talk about, since it's something that's on the mind of many of us, especially in Sfarad, we talked about the influx of Jews coming in, and they don't always get along with the descendants of the crypto-Jewish community or the Bnei Anusim. Is the relationship today with the Porto Jewish community and the descendants of crypto-Jews or the Bnei Anusim?
Well, even in the film, I mean, that really never happened. I mean, what happened was that there was a wish, there was a desire by Captain Baros Bastard, and that's what he thought. That's why he built such an enormous synagogue. He thought he would get this enormous community of descendants of crypto Jews, but that actually never happened. They ultimately did not join the community. They ultimately did not join even mainstream Judaism, except in Belmonte, so not in Porto. In Belmonte, you will find crypto Jews or descendants of crypto Jews or Moranos. And they went through a process of conversion and founded a community. In fact, I went to one of the first Pesachs there in the early 1990s, but not in Porto. I mean, we're basically, even though I'm Ashkenazi descent, they are mostly Sephardic. The community is definitely mostly Sephardic, but from not necessarily, I mean, there may be some that are descendants of crypto Jews, but I personally don't think there's a very large percentage that are. So that's not a factor, I would say, in the growth of the community today.
And so there isn't discussion either among it because it's such a small percentage.
Correct. It's not a thing. It's not a thing.
That makes sense. We're going to go now to Ashley. Thank you very much. Please stay on. Sure. Those who are listening, please continue to put in where you're signing in from so we get a feel and we can appreciate each other. And also put in questions or comments that you may have. And once we finish with my part of the interview, we will come to your questions in it. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ashley Perry, originally Perez, who's one of our partners in the Certificate of Sephardic Ancestry as part of Reconnectar. He is an international strategic communications consultant and election campaign advisor to international leaders, governments, companies, organizations, and individuals in a variety of fields and arenas at the highest levels globally, helping his clients win elections and successfully navigate political, business, and reputational campaigns. He is the president of Reconnectar, an organization that seeks to reconnect with over 200 million descendants of Spanish and Portuguese Jewish communities. And he is the former director of the Knesset Caucus for Reconnection with the Descendants of Spanish and Portuguese Jewish Communities. And on that note, did I miss something blatant?
To list my government positions, but we'll leave that for another time.
Okay, well, it might come up as we're talking too, right? So, so let's start. So first, you have a personal connection to this whole story. Can you tell us a little bit about your family's history?
Yeah, sure. I mean, part of it has actually been researched and identified by a cousin of mine in our wider Perez family. And we do know that the first member of our family to leave the Iberian Peninsula was at the beginning of the 16th century, where he fled through France. His name was Manuel Perez. Actually, it used to be spelt with an S, and then it went back to a Z, or Z, as Americans say, or back to. So depending whether they wanted to identify as Portuguese more or Spanish more, they used to use the S or the Z, the Z. But Manuel Perez was the first of my ancestors who left the Iberian Peninsula. Again, family or national folklore was that they'd been in the Iberian Peninsula 2,000 years, even from the first temple period. But obviously that has never been confirmed. We know the first Jews that ended up in Sepharad was in the Roman, or the first documented, let's put it that way, the first documented evidence was in the Roman period. But there is a tradition that some came before that. but yeah, my ancestor left pretty early in the 16th century, went through France, ended up in Hamburg, where there was a community there. Then through the Netherlands, which was a very
Which I just want to
famous.
point out, I'm not sure everybody knows there was a Sephardic community in Hamburg. That's
Okay. Yeah, it was a very significant one for the emigres from Spain and Portugal. Today it's tiny, it's mostly Ashkenazi. There are a few, but there's not really a community. Then they traveled to Amsterdam, which was at that time in the 17th, 18th century was one of the most important communities in the world. And then after the English Civil War, in the middle of the 17th century, there were 6 families invited from the Amsterdam Sephardic community to, of course, help reinvigorate the economy. There was negotiations between Manasseh ben Israel and Oliver Cromwell, and 6 families came across to London, and that's where my family ended up, and that's why I have this accent. We were in England, still are. I mean, I'm no longer, I'm speaking from Israel, but we're in England 350 plus years. So my connection to this story is, again, not everything can be entirely documented going back into the Iberian Peninsula, but from what we understand from some documents and some discussions and some conjecture, my family was from Cordoba in Spain, and in 1492 they took what was then the easiest route out of Spain, the expulsion. Obviously, we know the communities in Salonika, in in the Balkans, in Turkey, in Morocco, even in the land of Israel and other places. But the easiest route at the time was the land route, and that was across to Portugal, where you had to pay I don't know if it was significant or a small, my understanding, it was a significant amount to get to Portugal. And then in 1497, as Dara already mentioned, there was an expulsion, and I'll say quote unquote, because it was more of a political answer to a marriage sort of question, that the King of Portugal wanted to marry the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. But as Dara mentioned, he didn't really want to expel his Jews, so he came up with a way to expel them without expelling them, where most were forcibly converted. What's important to note is a large percentage, I'm not sure if we will ever know exactly what percentage of the Portuguese community at that point were Spanish emigres who had only fled 5 years ago, where it would have been much easier to have allowed themselves to be converted. So we can assume that the majority of the Spanish Jews who ended up in Portugal valued their Judaism enough to keep it, even with the unknown crossing of the border into Portugal. So when there were these forcible conversions, or let's say de facto conversions, a lot of them kept their Judaism for a generation or so. As again Dara mentioned, the king wasn't particularly interested in hounding the Jews early, and that's why it did take at least another generation or two for the Inquisition to come. There was a sort of a wink and a nod to the Jewish community: carry on what you're doing behind closed doors. We're not going to hound you, just don't do it openly. And it was probably, again, I don't know exactly, but probably events like that depicted in the movie which sent my ancestors out of the Iberian Peninsula. Could have been the opening of the Inquisition 25, whatever it was, years later. Interestingly enough, in 4 days, we'll be commemorating on the 23rd of May, that was the opening of the Inquisition in Portugal. Obviously, we know the Inquisition in Spain had started 1480 or 1481, but the Inquisition took a lot longer because there was no great interest in hounding the Jews at that point, and that obviously changed as the monarch changed and became more or less interested in basically hounding the Jews. What's interesting about this moment as well, because as I said, it and maybe other similar events led to my family, on its journey north, that a lot of people, they think of anti-Semitism as a relatively modern thing. As we know, the term was created by Wilhelm Marr at the end of the 19th century because they needed a word for something different. We have this idea, those who study Jewish history, that up until the modern era, it was largely anti-Jewish. It was more of a religious nature rather than a racial nature. But what we learn from films like the one that Porto made and many of the others, whether it's Sefarad or whether it's the Inquisition film, is that it was very much a racial thing, because even after they had been converted, they were still suspect. They were still considered Jews. They were still considered something different. Your blood was more important than your belief. And in fact, I'm not 100% sure on Portugal, but Spain introduced laws delineating your bloodline and preventing you from entering certain professions, preventing new and old Christians from marrying. So your blood was more important, even 500 years ago, was more important than your belief. So racial, prejudicial anti-Semitism is not a new thing, and that's I think another thing that's important to learn from these type of films. And as Dara said, we've been seeing these types of pogroms pretty much wherever Jews lived, regardless of whether it was Europe, North Africa, even Africa itself, Asia, obviously Europe, and we know the Inquisition came to the Americas, and there were massacres even in the Americas. But what's also important to know is that forcible conversions were not restricted to the Iberian Peninsula. We know that this was only the third, this was the third, and if you count Portuguese, the fourth time that Jews were forcibly converted, first through the Visigoths, then through Islam, then the Catholic monarchs in Spain, and then in Portugal. But we do know that almost all communities at one point were forcibly converted, whether it's France, Germany, Poland, Morocco, Yemen, the famous Mashhadi Jews, the Jews of Ethiopia, Russia. There were many. So it's probably fair to say that almost all Jews around the world, and considering at one point 90% of all world Jewry lived at one point in the Iberian Peninsula, that we are all Bnei Anusim, we are all the descendants of forcibly converted Jews. So it wasn't necessarily a new phenomenon. Obviously, the most famous forcible conversions are the ones that took place in the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the 15th century. So, but it's important and again, I'm going to be a little bit more contemporary with this, as the UN Secretary General Guterres, who himself is Portuguese, of course, liked to argue after the October 7th pogrom that it is in a context. It took place in a context. It didn't take place in a vacuum. Or we can say the same thing. The pogrom, the massacre of October 7th did not take place in a vacuum. It had context, and we can see for hundreds and hundreds of years this was happening. And October 7th didn't just fall from the sky. Unfortunately, we have a long and sordid history of these types of attacks on Jews simply because they're Jews, not because of what they believe, not because of an ideology they hold, not because of the passport they have in their back pocket or their safe or whatever it is. Jews were attacked simply for being Jews. And just to round off, or to bookend, I talked about my family history going back to this massacre at the beginning of the 16th century. October 7th also hit me personally or familiarly, as our nephew was killed on October 7th. He was part of the Golani Brigade guarding the Erez crossing, which ironically is exactly where Palestinian workers come in and out of Gaza to have work in Israel, and where aid and goods come in every single day. So he was guarding that, making sure that all these things happen. But that didn't spare him, as it didn't spare 1,200 other people that day. And his base was overrun. He managed to save the lives of at least 12 soldiers, but unfortunately he was killed that day. So very much impacted by October 7th. And it's unfortunately, we may not even know about how much all these massacres throughout history and these pogroms and these genocidal attempts, because thankfully we're still here, affected us and our family. But we are here today. So I guess that's the optimistic and the positive view, reaching back into history when we discuss all these types of events.
Right. And I think everybody needs a breath after that, because there was a lot there, but I'm going to try to pick up. No, it's good. And like I said, please do put in comments and questions. I will look at them afterwards, but I have a few more first. Let's focus now on some of the positive you were talking about. So you created Reconnectar to help promote the Sephardic heritage. So in the context, maybe not in the context of what you're saying, but what's the significance of that today?
So it's you know, my community, the Spanish Portuguese, the Western Sephardic, the Nashar, whatever you want to call it, community, for us, the Inquisition, the expulsion is still very much part of our immediate memory. I mean, it's quite amazing to me when you think about it that on Yom Kippur, after Carne Dre, we still say in 2024, well, we will say it later, we said it in 2023, we still say a prayer for our brethren imprisoned by the Inquisition. Now, that's a remarkable thing, because the Inquisition hasn't existed for at least 130, 40 years, and it hasn't really killed anyone or really had dungeons in the way that it used to in its heyday, to put it that way, for even much longer. But for us, it's very much part of our memory. You know, we are a community that was, you know, that came out of the forcible conversions, the expulsions, etc. So for us, this is very much part of our communal memory. So I always grew up with, you know, knowledge of the Inquisition and the forcible conversions and expulsions, etc., etc. But it was not until about 2015, when I was working in the Israeli government, that I met someone who just blew my mind with some research that he'd done for about 2 years. I'm not going to go into exactly how I met him, but it was really by chance. It was the Minister of Agriculture, Yair Shamir, son of the famous Yitzhak Shamir, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who introduced me to this guy. And he told me that he told Yair Shamir and whatever, that there were around 100 million descendants. And I'm not going to get into the terminology, converso, maranos, or anusim.
Or a whole other talk, please.
I just say descendants of Spanish and Portuguese Jewish communities, because that doesn't put any ideological, theological reference to it. And at first I didn't believe him, but he showed me the data, whatever. Interestingly enough, it was before Corona, so that would have been 2018. There was an international multidisciplinary study on the origins of the people in Latin America, by a very prestigious Nature magazine, which is one of the most prestigious scientific magazines or publications in the world, where they basically wanted to understand the origins of the people of Latin America. They wanted how many indigenous, how many European, etc., etc. And the most startling result they came across is that 1 in 4, 25%, had significant Jewish ancestry. And that was a mind-blowing number, because if you extrapolate the numbers and you add a bit from Spain and Portugal and southern Italy or whatever, you get to around 200 million. Now, again, I don't want to scare people with numbers. Just because 200 million people have significant quote-unquote Jewish ancestry, that doesn't mean that they're Jews, doesn't mean that they want to be Jews, doesn't mean we should force them into anything. But there is a growing number, thanks to DNA tests, thanks to genealogical advances, thanks to simple Google searches. There is a significant amount of people coming every day who do want something from that. They do want some sort of answer. And we decided then to create the organization Reconectar, which means reconnection in Spanish and Portuguese, to provide some sort of solutions. Again, we are not missionizing. I'm not going to anyone and telling them you should be this, you should do that. They come to us and say, I want to know more about history. I want to know more about Jewish culture. I want to know more about Sephardic traditions. I want to know how to convert. I want to know how to visit Israel. I want thousands and thousands and thousands of different things. So we decided to create an answer, not the answer, and we're certainly not the only ones doing it. And so that's when we had the idea to create Reconectar. And we also started working with the Israeli government, first in the Knesset. As you talked about the Knesset committee that we founded, we also created a governmental committee, which wrote a whole paper, a working paper on what the Israeli and Jewish world response should be to this phenomena. It's not just the Spanish Portuguese. There's also, in Poland and Hungary, there's a lot of people who are descended from Jews during communism or fascism. They lost it, and many, many other communities, but the largest obviously is the Spanish Portuguese. And we helped them create the recommendations. That's a report which officially was adopted by the government, and we're constantly working with the government to try and implement some of the recommendations. We also wrote the first ever law for a day of commemoration for the victims of the Inquisition. That went through its first step, not the first reading, unfortunately, before Israel started having this, fantastic relation with elections. So basically there hadn't been government, and then there was COVID, and then there was the war. So we hope at one point to get that back up and moving, and hopefully that'll happen soon. So, and also obviously draw you as one of our partners with the the certificate of Sephardic ancestry. That's another initiative that we're moving forward. So there's a lot of different balls that we're juggling at once, but it's clear that there is a phenomenon, and it's clear that there needs to be a response from the Jewish world, from the state of Israel, and that's what we're sort of working on, slowly but surely.
So since you brought that up, I'm going to break in the middle of my questions, because Georgina asked a question to both of you. If you work to connect with Jews from the Caribbean at all, because they did descend from that area.
Again, I've had many people from Caribbean, from Curacao, from Jamaica, from other parts. Cuba, obviously, is a big one. Jeannie, one of our partners, her family originally is from Cuba. So there is quite a significant, today it's not a significant Jewish presence, but there is a significant Jewish heritage, let's say, in certain parts. And also, let's not forget, throughout Latin America, and Central America and the Caribbean, it all depended which country colonized. If it was the Spanish, if it was the Portuguese, if it was the Dutch, we know that a lot of northern Brazilians have Jewish heritage, specifically because that's the area that the Dutch conquered, and the Netherlands at that point was a lot more tolerant and allowed Jews to live freely there. And also, as we know, in Amsterdam, one of the most important companies at the time was the Dutch West Indies company, and they used to come across a lot. So we know that then the Portuguese reconquered it and basically didn't allow a lot of the Jews or the descendants of Jews to leave. So that's why there's a big concentration there. So if we look throughout Latin America, we can see where there's large concentrations, usually because there's historic meaning and events that happened which led to that.
Mm-hmm. Dara, do you have something to add about the Porto community?
No, well, we don't do that sort of work. Obviously, we focus on people that come to us in our community. We don't do outreach in that way. Jeannie Milgram is a perfect example of someone that is doing that sort of work. But I will add a little note to what you just said, which is, if you've been to the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, they have a little symbol of a caravel. And I think that's super interesting, because a lot of the Jewish ship makers, there were map makers and ship makers, were very involved in the shipping and generally with the caravels in Portugal, that ended up being some of the people that left and went to Amsterdam and went to Holland. So I thought that was very interesting that they have that little symbol of the ship.
Right, so they are connected. So I'm going to go back to my question to Ashley now about current events. We're hearing more and more that the events going on in college campuses around the world and on the streets of major cities, actually talking about Jeannie. She just sent a picture today of Barcelona with a huge Palestinian flag and a lot of anti-Israel rhetoric being chanted there. So it seems that from the events of 1506, that there is this parallel. And you spoke a little bit about history repeating itself, but can you specifically talk about maybe the college campuses or the main streets of London?
Right. And online and everywhere else. I think what's important is, again, to show that Jews are held to different standards. Jews are definitely treated differently. I've always asked people who take to the streets, or people who don't understand why others take to the streets. It's interesting, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we didn't see these mass protests. We didn't see Russians hunted on the streets. We didn't see any Russian not allowed in there or here, there, or everywhere. But what China is doing to the Uyghurs and other communities, we certainly don't see Chinese people singled out. We didn't see Arabs or Muslims because of what Bashar al-Assad, what the Ayatollahs are doing in Iran and various other places. But there seems to be something very different. Jews, it's almost as if, again, and I'm being maybe a bit flippant here, but anti-Semitism never went away. What we basically see is flare-ups where people feel more emboldened to speak their mind and to say things that perhaps they always felt, or perhaps they didn't even think about. And when these things happen, you know, Jews are considered throughout history, whatever you wanted, whatever the most evil thing that you could think about. If you were communist, the Jews were fascists. If the fascists, Jews were communists. Jews were, you know, attacked for being too rich, for too poor, too integrated, not integrated enough, being too white as we are today. But what is it, 75, 80 years ago, we were massacred in the millions for not being white. In fact, not even being on the human ladder of colors. If you look at the Nazi racial scheme, the Jews didn't fit on, you know, the sort of human ladder. We were separate. And again, we are separate. We are being accused of whatever it is that you want the most evil to be. Today it's genocide. You know, they tried the Nazis, they tried to call us Nazis, and they understood that that had difficult connotations. Then they tried apartheid, but most people don't really understand what apartheid is. But now the moniker that fits is genocide. And there's a massive amount of irony that the people most subjected to genocide throughout our history are the ones now being accused of that very same crime, because it has such massive repercussions, and it's branding at its greatest and at its worst. But what I think we should understand, and this is my belief at the end of it, is that there is a silent majority that doesn't necessarily buy into a lot of these things. There is a very loud minority. You know, we see thousands on university campuses, or hundreds here, or tens of thousands here. But I still believe, I mean, we saw again, you know, in the Eurovision Song Contest results. Again, I don't want to put too much on that, but it was the sort of the elites who didn't want to give Israel any points, the judges, the people who work for the TV channels or the music industry or whatever. They gave Israel, I think they, according to them, Israel was 12th or 13th. And then suddenly the public vote came out and Israel got the second largest. So I think there's a lot of people who don't see Israel and the Jews in the same way, but these guys are not taken to the streets. You know, you don't take to the streets for positive things. Oh, we think the Jews aren't so bad. Let's have a banner about that. It just doesn't happen. Unfortunately, there's always been this violent and aggressive minority which have felt this way about the Jews and always want to impose whatever their largest hatred is onto the Jewish people. And now they're having a field day, but I still do not believe that they are the majority.
Let me just add something, though, that troubles me the most. And the big difference, I think, today from any time in the past is social media. Right. And the speed at which propaganda and false narratives get disseminated, and particularly to young people. And that's, I think, to me, the most concerning thing. And the fact that it's very difficult to combat. And personally, I think Israel is losing the propaganda war. And I've been fighting it personally, like with friends that are Muslim, and it's an impossible war to fight. And I get bombarded with things. They send me all these things. And then I'm like, but that's just not true. And look at this and look at that, you know? But the problem is, when we want to tell the story of Jews and history and Israel, it's a complex story. You can't just say it from the river to the sea. I mean, we don't have a slogan that we can just throw out there, and it makes it so easy for people to latch onto. It's like, wait, let me explain the whole thing. So what happened was, and you have to tell this whole long story and explain, and then we had this war, and then this happened, and that happened. And I don't have like a 5-second slogan that I can throw back at people when they tell me, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and this is the era we live in. We live in the era of slogans, of people with very short attention spans, with no knowledge of history, but they don't care about history. They don't care about knowing. They don't care about delving into matters. It's what's thrown at them. And we're talking about, 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, 15 or 20 million Jews in the world. So even just by the numbers, we don't have a lot of like ammunition in terms of like just on social media, let alone on anything else. So to me, it's a huge social media issue. And I think that is where we need to be, focusing our efforts, whether it be in Congress, whether it be wherever, that this sort of, hate speech or outright lies and conspiracy theories should be outlawed. I don't think it's all right to have things, being circulating between people that are completely false. And as I say, lead to very serious consequences.
Well, I think...
I'm sorry. I was at the ANU, as you are, Tor, as well, the ANU premiere of this film, and we had a panel discussion with Michal Kotler-Wunsch, a former member of Knesset and Israel's official envoy to combat anti-Semitism. We had someone from the WZO. We have Alex Strayman of JNS, and I said at the time, I believe we can not necessarily win this war, but we can certainly fight back much better. And as someone who runs campaigns around the world, you can move the needle. You have to understand how. And if we're trying to go against the opposition, if we're trying to take on the other side, let's say, we're never going to win. Those are people, in any campaign, you don't try and get the strongest base of your opponent's supporters, because that doesn't get you most bang for your buck. We have to get the soft support on either side. We have to get the undecideds, and that's the majority. And I believe we can.
That's true.
Start moving there. Unfortunately, having worked in the Israeli government for about 15 years, I can tell you, with all the challenges, whether it's internal politics or whether we just allowed the Palestinians for many years to get a jump on us. Ever since 1993, there was a feeling with Oslo, with all the optimism that brought in, that we have good policy. We don't need good, quote unquote, propaganda. We don't need good public relations. And we left the playing field for 10, 15 years, and we're playing catch up. And it's a ridiculous idea, because let's take Coca-Cola or McDonald's, which they're terrible products health-wise, but they're wonderful products taste-wise, and they work, and everybody around the world knows them and eats them. Yet McDonald's or Coca-Cola wouldn't suddenly, we've got a good market here, let's take our foot off the gas, and I think we'll be able to hold our numbers. It wouldn't happen. It doesn't work in any industry. And we made that mistake. And we allowed ourselves to get tarnished. I mean, if we look back to the roots, a lot of it started in the 2001 Durban conference that was supposed to talk about human rights, global human rights, and slavery and xenophobia, and it was hijacked. People know about the Durban conference, but no one knows about the preliminary conference. And where was the preliminary conference where they discussed what goes on the agenda and what doesn't? Tehran. Tehran basically decided the agenda for the most important event of the century, to talk about human rights, xenophobia, slavery. And instead of actually dealing with the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people who desperately needed this, they hijacked it to try and create momentum against Jewish people and the Jewish state. And we got caught out, and we've been playing catch up ever since. We do have answers. We can fight back. Unfortunately, we're just not doing it as well. We're doing better. 10 years ago, we certainly were a lot worse. When events happen in Gaza, it would take us sometimes 2-3 weeks to get the truth out. Now, we can get it out in 2 to 3 hours, which is so much better. But we can be doing much better, because, as Dara said, and again, to go back to the reason we're here, conspiracy theories throughout the ages have always revolved, regardless of what they are. They can be the most bizarre things. I mean, I've heard some of the things that come out in the last few years are Jews control the weather. I think there was a governor or a senator who said in the US that Jews control the weather. The Iranians believe that Israel has a fleet of dolphins with some sort of sonar or radar.
Yeah.
I mean, but people do believe it. So if you can believe those, then surely you can believe that Jews control the media, the financial capitals, the Hollywood, and all these other things. So it's a very small leap to then looking at the Jews as some sort of demonic superpower, because during the Middle Ages, it was simply, there was a plague. Maybe there was no period where the Jews weren't being killed by the plague. Maybe because of our sanitary laws, that perhaps we weren't being killed in as great numbers, so automatically the Jews must be behind it, and the blood libels, and etc., etc. So unfortunately, conspiracy theories always seem to tie up with the Jews. And as Dara said, with social media, when a conspiracy theory maybe 50 years ago used to be on the corners, and people in very small groups or whatever, today it's so easy for one person to create a conspiracy theory. And a lot of people will think, oh, maybe there's no smoke without fire. But now it's not in the tens, the hundreds, the thousands, the tens of thousands. It's in the millions, the tens of millions, hundreds of millions. So that's what we're facing today.
But like Ellie said, it's not necessarily conspiracy. it's just the lies, like Dara was saying before also. Once you have a lie out there, it's very hard to say, you know, I don't have a sister, that thing.
Right.
Once the lie is out there, it's very hard to respond to it. And I think we saw that back in 1506, and I think we see that today. So it might have been a little slower to spread the lie at that point, but you saw in the movie and you see through history, the lies spread. It's not a problem, unfortunately. And responding to that today or at that point is
It's a
not so easy.
challenge, a very big challenge. And that is one of the things we were trying to say in the movie, right? Is to show how these things start, you know, and how easy it is for people to get inflamed and how brutal they can be once they are inflamed, you know. And so I think that was really the point, and that it's not new. It's not new.
So I do encourage everybody who hasn't seen the movie yet to see it. We were asked if we can also provide links to where to see the other films. So Dara, if you send those to
you, and I'll send them to you, and then you can circulate. Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, I will share the links to the different movies put out by the Porto community. I also want to make sure that everybody is aware that What's in a Jewish Name is going to be presented by us on June 2nd at noon Eastern time with Dr. Debbie Koren, based on a response from the Middle Ages. It's interesting, again, we talk about the parallels between then and now. They were trying to understand how much they should be Jewish outward. How much do we have to hide? Very much things that we're talking about today, but she's going to base it in a responsa. We're going to go through tracing your Sephardic roots with Jeannie Milgram and Georgina Garcia on June 23rd. And I have one more thing. So Ellie continued, it's also about the great professors in political science who, I think there are some typos here, sorry. And okay, so
I know what she's saying. That's true. My kid is in college, so I get a lot of feedback, and he's doing political science. And so it's very interesting to see his take on that. And it's exactly right. So it's very easy for people are not well educated, their audiences. And so if you get, like you said, professors that then have this analysis that they claim is objective, it's very easy to persuade young minds to go in a particular.
Which again is often based on lies, which to me, okay, but I'm going to let each of you, I'm not going to sum it up based on my frustration with the lies. I'm going to let each of you take a minute or two just to tell us one thing you want us to walk away with from today.
I think I would say, and I think it's what I've come away from this, is that Jews in the past, and I think this is what's changed me a lot, particularly since October 7th, we've always been very much about thinking the best in people, right? And that, it'll all go away, it'll all be fine. I'm really a German, I'm really an American, I'm really a Portuguese, I'm a real person, it'll be fine, it'll all be fine. And, maybe it won't be fine. And I'm not trying to be negative, but what I'm saying is that I think the important thing is that we can't be quite so passive as we've been in the past. We do have to, when people send me messages, like in the past, I would never have said anything, be like, oh, what do they know? Now I'm like, no, excuse me, that's not correct. Let me tell you the facts. And so I'm much more about educating people when they send me clips or I see that they've gone down the wrong path, to be like, no, look what happens. And I send them the movie and I'd be like, see, this is what happens when you talk about things that aren't true. It ends up like that. So I'm a little bit more combative, I would say, in the sense that I would have been in the past, about making sure that people do know the truth and not just letting it sit. That's what I would say. We all have to be a bit more active about making sure that things on social media are corrected and stopped. That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, going back to Guterres's comment, there is context, and not the context that he's talking about, but the context that there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to Jews. It's not, October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. Happened through hundreds, if not thousands of years of prejudice that just kept on happening. And again, it morphed, it evolved, it progressed, but it always had that same kernel of hate, and whether it was against Jews as a religion, whether it was against Jews as a race, if you want to use that term. I don't like it, but Jews as a people, let's say, now Jews as a nation. It's the same motifs are going again. The Jews obsessed with blood, the Jews want to kill the children, the Jews don't care about anyone else, they want to control the world. It's what they used to say about the Jew throughout the years. Now they say about the Jewish nation or the Jewish state. But the difference is, and I think this is, I want to end on a optimistic, positive, and even Zionist note, if I may. But I always say to my kids and other people, you know, I studied history. I don't call myself a historian, but I studied history, and you know, I've become fascinated with my particular family history. And you know, I'm married to an Ashkenazi woman with a, you know, she's third generation Holocaust or second generation. Her grandmother survived, so I guess that means second generation Holocaust survivor. And you know, and there's many stories from Morocco, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from all over. All of our ancestors, regardless of where they were, and even if they were in the New Jerusalem of Amsterdam or in London and New York today and all these other places, you know, we didn't have a state, we didn't have a place to run. And I think most of our ancestors would have given so much, would have given their limbs to just experience 1 minute of what we ourselves experience in the 20th and 21st century. My father, who was born in 1919, at the end of the First World War, and of course in the Second World War, would always say something to me growing up, and I always repeat it because it's something which I didn't understand for many years, and I repeat it to my kids all the time, is we don't know what it's like to live in the world as a Jew without the state of Israel. My father did, and my father became, he was not a religious man, he was a proud Jew, but not particularly anything, but then he became a passionate Zionist because he understood what a difference Israel made to the Jewish nation, to the Jewish people around the world. And today we can defend ourselves. Yes, October 7th was a terrible event, but we are strong and we are powerful, whether we're in the diaspora or not, whether we're in Israel or whether we're in New York or Miami or Amsterdam or Porto or Paris or whatever it may be, that we are stronger than we've ever been before. And we will repel this, whether it's on the battlefield or the battlefield of ideas. We will win because we have no choice, and we have survived much worse, and we have to put it in context for ourselves as well, going back to that contextual, you know, terminology. You know, if we look at the context of what our ancestors suffered in Lisbon at the beginning of the 16th century, we had no one to protect us. Only after 3 days of bloodshed, where 3,000 people were murdered, we had to rely on the local authorities, and they tried, and you can see in the video, they tried a few times to try and quell the violence and seek the peace, but it wasn't the Jews who could fight back. They had no real ability to do so. We had to rely on others, and only when the local populations got bored or the leaders wanted to take back control was Jewish blood stopped. Today we are masters of our own agency for the first time in 2,000 years. And I think that's something that we really need to put in context. And that's my positive, optimistic note to end it. And yeah, so I would stress for everybody to watch all the films. And there's a new film coming out by the end of the year, which I think is also important, about an even less known event where 2,000 children were kidnapped around the same years, 1496, I think it was, where they were basically kidnapped and sent to the island of Sao Tome. I'm sure I'm butchering the accent, how to say it, but an island of Africa, where basically most of them did not survive. And that's, again, it's just so important to understand our history, to understand these moments, because they came again, and because we have to, without these moments, it's very hard to build a sort of map of Jewish history to really give context for where we are today. So I think, I thank Porto for what they're doing to really give a voice and imagery, which is very important, especially in today's era where people need that imagery, to give the story context, to give the story to people who wouldn't read about it, who wouldn't learn about it, but will sit and watch a 20-minute video. And it's so important what Porto is doing. And I really want to, just finish by thanking Dara and all of the community for the wonderful and amazing work that they're doing. And long may you continue.
I definitely second that. And I encourage, as Ashley did, everybody to go and watch it. Dara will send me the links, and please continue this conversation. As Dara said, we need to continue. We need to respond, and we need to continue. And the history is there. We want to make sure that people know it. So thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you for ending it on a positive note, Ashley.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, Dara. Thank you, Dara.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.